Vice President Kamala Harris decided to wade into the controversy over former President Trump's visit to Arlington National Cemetery last week. The former president attended the wreath-laying ceremony for the 13 service members murdered in the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan 3 years ago. Here's what the vice president had to say. Donald Trump's team chose to film a video there, resulting in an altercation with cemetery staff. Let me be clear, the former president disrespected sacred ground, all for the sake of a political stunt. Now, the Trump campaign disputes reports of an altercation, and meantime, family members of some of the 13 service members lost took time out of their Labor Day weekends to respond to that post. Here's what they had to say.
Vice President Harris, my name is Steve Nakui. I'm the father of Lance Corporal Kareem M. Nakui. And your administration killed my son.
It's been 3 years since my son was killed in action, and myself, my family, and other Gold Star families have not seen any support from you or your administration.
Your recent remarks related to Trump's visit to Arlington are filled with nothing but lies and deceit.
Vice President Harris, I ask you, why won't you return a call and explain to us how you call my daughter-in-law's death a success?
You have 13 families who have been waiting over 3 years to so much as get a phone call, to so much as hear our kids' names.
Let me be clear. There was no politics discussed, none whatsoever. There was also not an assault that we observed take place, or did we hear it? I don't know where this is coming from, but it's disgusting and gross.
Powerful voices, Joey.
Yeah, I think if President Trump and his team had to do over again, maybe they leave the official photographers in the van. The original statement was they weren't going to get them out until the families asked them to. So then I asked myself, you know, if they broke federal law by taking pictures rather than getting them from DVids, which is what some others have done, the Department of Defense video team, maybe they didn't know they were going to go over to Section 60. He was there to lay a wreath at the tomb, and then I believe he was invited over to Section 60 by those family members. When I sit here and look at this, I go, okay, Kamala Harris saying something about this is like stepping in dog crap, walking into my house and being mad at me that I don't have potpourri, right? She made this problem. She and her boss orchestrated what they called the most successful airlift in the history of the world that just happened to kill 13 service members and have yet to even say their name. I've been in a green room at a charity event with two of those families. One of them looked at me and said, he came up to us and started talking about his son that died from cancer when we had just buried ours or had just lost ours. He made it about him. Joe Biden doesn't understand their grief and loss because his son died of cancer in a hospital bed. I give Beau Biden all the honor in the world for serving and nothing disparaging towards him at all. But Joe Biden has continually tried to turn his son's death into something like a Gold Star family member, and that is such an affront to them. So if we're just stacking grievances here, President Trump goes to Arlington to honor 13 service members at the request of their family members, follows their family members to Section 60 to take pictures at the request of those family members, decides to let his official photographer take those pictures, and that's what they're mad at him about. President Biden allowed them to die, aggrieved them or was really rude in his own way to them when he met them, looked at his watch when they were coming off the plane, has yet to say their name, and Kamala Harris, the last one in the room, sure as hell wasn't in Arlington to honor them. So if you're just wanting to stack what was rude or offensive to those who have lost men and women serving this country, I think that President Trump's on the right side of it. If he broke rules or even laws in order to honor a request by those family members, I have no problem with that.
I absolutely agree with that. And for her to say it was a political stunt, these families have lost their loved ones. They've lost their son or daughter. That is not a political stunt. And frankly, I think she is the one that's turning this into a political stunt. I think that if she had any remorse for what she did, first of all, she thinks that, like you said, it was a success. A success, you are completely out of touch with reality. And these families, they just want to be heard. Okay, yeah. I've dealt with, line of duty deaths in law enforcement and the FBI and with, local law enforcement. They just want to know that their child or their loved one's life was not lost in vain, and no one will even listen to them. How dare them not say the names of their own service members. And frankly, if she admits it and says their names, then she has to admit what she did. She's part of the problem. She was the cause of this.
Doctor.
Yeah, you know, paying respect to our fallen heroes, this is a long-standing tradition that far transcends politics. And this is an event that should unite all of us together, not, serve as a political stunt or claim that it's all about political gain. That's far from the truth. And my brother, Mike Waltz, and my sister, Captain Julia, they were there at this event with President Trump. And Mike told me that one of the mothers, one of the Gold Star moms, she couldn't be there. So Mike FaceTimed her and talked to her from there, from the, where her child was buried. And then President Trump, he joined in on that FaceTime, and that mom was so happy. And this in itself helped her to heal, to help grieve from the tremendous loss. So it shows the support and the leadership of President Trump and how much he cares about our fallen heroes and about our military.
Her entire foreign policy would be a political stunt if she were president. And I have no doubt she would execute the same sort of arbitrary, politically motivated, horrific withdrawal like they did from Afghanistan that these family members and voters have not forgotten. And, not only did they create a tragedy where 13 new service members were killed, but it just spits in the face of people who served in Afghanistan, people who lost their lives there, veterans who have taken their lives since Afghanistan, particularly after the withdrawal. Like, there's so much about it that is so incredibly defensive. And Nicole is absolutely right. This whole thing is just a distraction from, the horrific decisions that were made in terms of that withdrawal, which she obviously was a massive part of, which she bragged about. So, is this how she should be rewarded? Getting a glossy retelling of this event that took place last Monday. I hope there is video released. I hope we do find the truth. And I hope there is some exoneration in there. And I hope voters see that what she is doing, fanning the flames politically and using this, is so deeply offensive.
Real quick before we go, on the idea of finding the truth. One of the issues the families have, not all of them, but the few that I've talked to have, that isn't talked about enough, isn't just that President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris haven't honored their sons and daughters enough. They don't believe they've ever gotten the truth on what actually happened that day. One family member, and I have nothing to substantiate this other than I believe this is what this dad believes, told me that he saw bullet holes in his son, not just blast injuries. And he doesn't believe that they were given the true story on what happened that day. I don't know if that's true, but they believe they might get that if President Trump becomes president again. So that's why it matters to them. And that's why they probably wouldn't have a problem with it being a campaign ad, because they believe it should be a campaign issue, because they don't believe that the right people are leading this country. And they've paid the ultimate price to have that opinion.
They deserve the utmost respect and honor.
That's right.